Welcome to the How Cities Are Embracing the Internet of Things. We have an exciting lineup, and our panelists here have a great, vast amount of experience in the smart cities sector. But first, let me quickly introduce the panelists before we jump into our discussion. So I'm going to first introduce Janet Makbul. She's a senior academic staff member at WinTech with the Waikato Institute of Technology, where she collaborates with industry. She currently supports the technology and innovation ecosystem in New Zealand, including working as a smart cities advisor at Hamilton City Council, director of development and partnerships at the university's AI initiative, and director of the New Zealand Smart Cities Council, focusing on data leadership. She serves as a principal advisor with a Singapore-based tech research firm, Ecosystem, as well. Thank you, Janet. Next, we have Mark Thomas. He's the founder and managing director of ServiceWorks, which is an international consultancy providing strategic counsel on city buildings, smart city applications, city strategy, public policy, and customer service. He is also a keynote speaker and board member of various events and organizations. Welcome, Mark. And lastly, we have Dr. Jonathan Reichenthal. He currently runs a consulting firm called Human Future. He is a professor and faculty advisor at University of California, Berkeley and University of San Francisco. He is a keynote speaker and author. We'll learn more about that in a bit, and was a CIO, CTO for 10 plus years, including serving as CIO for the city of Palo Alto. And lastly, I'll introduce myself, Stephanie Atkinson. I am the CEO and founder of Compass Intelligence. I produce and work with many customers on smart cities research projects, and also produce research reports on the market. And I'm also a founder of VMark, a marketing and creative agency, as well as speaker, author, and we all wear many titles. That's just part of the job, right? Okay, so let's kick this off. So just a little bit of background around smart cities. So smart cities, they're open, high-tech, eco-friendly, responsive, and innovative, serving citizens and the community with optimized services. That's it in a nutshell. And with that comes technology and IoT, or the Internet of Things. So understanding what makes a city smart is very important to define, plan, and develop goals for internal city planning, budget prioritization, and project planning. And each city or region is very unique in its own nature. So I want to kick off this session and discuss how cities are embracing IoT for city automation and citizen-centric services, along with a discussion around city planning and getting started. So let's get this kicked off. So Janet, first up, you have hands-on experience with innovation projects in New Zealand and while working with the Smart Cities Council there. Can you share with us some of the key ingredients you believe are important for cities to prepare or to begin innovation projects? So, and maybe more specifically, IoT related projects, since that's our topic.
Yep, great. Thanks, Stephanie. Great to be here. So at the Smart Cities Council, we talk about cities being livable, workable, and sustainable. So if you break that down, we're talking about people, as you mentioned, the citizen-centric, and we're also talking about future and future-proofing. So considering all the forces that are at play globally around and providing an impetus for smart cities, the smart cities movement, urbanization, inadequate infrastructure, economic competition, environmental challenges, and obviously what you've mentioned there around IoT, but also other emerging technologies that are coming to fruition now. And despite all of those sort of positives and pressures to develop a smart city, and you would almost consider, you know, such great influence in actually getting it right, there are a number of obstacles that smart cities also face. You know, the existing approaches to doing things in piecemeal. Expectations are always growing and changing of the different stakeholders involved. The budgets are shrinking. Investment capital is harder and harder to get. And then there are existing systems and expensive redundancy because the wrong decision has been made, or we're not future-proofing some of our technology investment. So if you have a look at that and the need for integration amongst all of those things, stakeholders and systems, despite, you know, with the positive and negative forces, it's really, really, really important to get it right from the start. So when you're going down the smart cities road. In New Zealand, we focus very much on that the city is for citizens. So it's about valuing citizen participation with councils, and the council's making a commitment to embedding both those elements, so being citizen-led and also valuing citizen participation as part of the Smart City strategy. So this means prioritizing investment that can deliver genuine benefits for citizens and embracing user-based design approaches. And then measuring the success of smart cities initiatives based on what you've unpacked by involving the citizens and ensuring that they remain at the center. That would be the first thing. And so we're talking about civic innovation, not just citizen powered, but not just citizen involvement, but also citizen powered. There are other stakeholders as well, though, and importantly, the stakeholders are from within the organization itself. So just like any other project, you have to think what's in it for me, for the wider stakeholder pool as well. So that's the second thing. So your internal, so make sure you're outward focusing to actually what your purpose is as a city, and then look at your council internally. And the magic happens when you match the what's in it for me for everybody that's involved with the citizen-centric approach that the city vision is following. And then you need champions. So amongst all those stakeholders that you've identified, you need champions that are championing that vision. And after that, it becomes easier. That's when you actually have to then do the planning and the investment takes place. And with those right people on board and being very clear about where you're headed, this becomes around ensuring that when you're taking incremental steps. So it's more of a roadmap. So developing a roadmap to where you want to be as a city is the other key ingredient. And taking stock at the start of that as to what your strengths and weaknesses currently are as a city, and using that as a base to then develop your roadmap in collaboration with all those stakeholders that I've mentioned. So it's pretty simple, really. Being very clear about where you're headed and why you're doing it, having the right people involved, and then considering it as a roadmap and celebrating successes along the way, and ensuring that those stakeholders that have bought in initially remain engaged throughout the process.
No, I think that's really, really helpful. I mean, you summarize it at the very end quite well. As you know, it's not just citizen involvement, but having the champions and building that roadmap. So one quick tip before we move forward with the next question, and that is, if you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A at the in the Zoom app, and do not put them in the chat. We're going to be, it's easier for us to manage the questions in one spot. So if you could pose any questions you have for our panelists, we're going to hold some time at the end to do that and answer your questions. So the next question I have is for Mark. So you share with me that you're working on providing city planning and strategies for cities in Asia, and more specifically for cities like Taipei and other cities based in Singapore. Can you share some of the more interesting projects that you're supporting and how you got started with these cities, or how did you help them get started?
Sure, thanks, Stephanie. And look, I think Jeanette's given a terrific overview for a lot of the general approaches that more cities need to take. So I'll sort of dive down into two specific examples that I'm aware of. Taipei, which is the largest city in Taiwan, and Singapore. And they've had a similar approach, but there's been some differences. I think at the core of their approach has been this idea of having a home for the smart city building activity. Now I'm going to talk later about how that home doesn't have to be, you know, a city project office or a government office. That home can start actually with you. But in the case of Taiwan, what they established was the Smart City Project Management Office. And that really was to pick up the array of activities that were being delivered through different city departments. But this can often be the case. As Jeanette said, people focus on the problems, right? And they'll develop solutions. And too often that's done in a siloed way. So what Taiwan did very early on was recognize, look, let's try and aggregate these. Singapore, as I'll talk about, has arguably been a bit more strategic and a bit more focused. But I think that Taiwan's approach, it's a country of 24 million, 25 million, so mid-ranked, similar size to many in Europe and to a number of US states. So it's kind of a bit more comparable than Singapore, right? Which is a bit unusual. So they collected up this amalgam of things that were happening in common smart areas: waste, water, transport, but then look for opportunities in new areas. So elderly health checks, wireless charging, free wireless charging in cities. How many cities do you know that provide that? So focusing on the things that kind of people had ideas on, but then aggregating it into a project management office. And then what they did was launch hero initiatives, like, for example, the Taipei IIoT experimental platform. So various cities have versions of these sorts of things, which is critically designed to kind of get startups and new ideas coming in, recognizing cities don't know all the answers. And to Jeanette's point, if we want to be sort of citizen-led or citizen-engaged, we've actually got to have them in the kitchen kind of helping sort the data out, if we use that example. So this IoT experimental platform is an experimental field where innovative ideas about how to connect IoT applications, or even what they should be, can be implemented and accelerated, and then kind of channeled to the specific subject matter area, waste, water, transport, whatever it was. They've attracted, through this platform, 80 startup teams signing up for trials to help sort of develop specific initiatives. One of those that actually achieved quite a lot of profile is their integrated emergency data platform. So this is an IoT sort of hazard early warning platform that predicts and monitors flooding. So it uses sort of central local databases to create different disaster scenarios, and it can predict areas which will be more prone to flooding. Gives members of the public 48 hours warning on average of kind of how things are tracking, and gives them some guidance as to what to do. So that's the kind of an example of something that kind of came from the startup ecosystem and has developed into a major project. Just briefly, in Singapore, I mean, people may know about Singapore's sort of Smart Nation plan, which actually only was launched in 2014, relatively recently. But of course, that built on decades actually of digital enablement, which of course in a country of 6 million, that's it's actually a bit slightly larger than one of our largest lakes here in New Zealand, right? So it's not so big, which gives it some advantages. But what they've done is focused on 6 key areas: urban living, transport, health, digital government services, and then strategic initiatives, e-payments, and startups as well. So one of their big priorities is startups and innovation. And that one of the consequences of that in the urban living has been a new sort of sensor platform, which operates at city level, and it aggregates municipal services, so waste, rubbish, into one sort of portal that people can access to kind of check and see what the city services are. So look, 2 examples from 2 different cities about the approach they've taken strategically to deliver kind of meaningful services for citizens on the ground.
No, it's interesting. We're hearing a lot of that as well. It's not just about the city itself, but it's also engaging with the universities, the startup community, other open working stations and places that are happening kind of throughout the city. So that's interesting. So that kind of leads me to my next question, Mark, with you is, can you talk a little bit about the role of economic development? Because a lot of cities are not just looking for technology to really enable citizens, but they're also looking to attract people, businesses, research, all of that to their city, so they could really just make a name for themselves and attract that economic development, really spur on that economic development. Can you talk a little bit about how that might play a role in IoT?
Sure. Look, the one thing I'd say, I'm hopeful most people on the call will be aware of this, but McKinsey's did this now famous study a bit over a year ago, looking at the value to cities and the economies of cities. They looked at 50 cities, actually around the world, and a whole series of indicators. And they found across these 50 cities that there could be a 10 to 30% quality of life improvement. So this is sort of saving lives by having quicker emergency transport, get to accidents, shorter commutes, of course, that we know about, lower health burdens, better climate change outcomes. So big picture, right? This is the economy of a city, the ecosystem. So if you haven't had a look at that McKinsey report, it's very detailed, and it talks at quite a specific level about the city services and what the potential savings would be. So more broadly, we think of smart cities as a technology play, and we underestimate, and in the investment projects I've seen, they often underestimate the broader economic development potential. So big picture, there's an obvious economic development potential upside from being more efficient with your technology. But specifically, if we look at what economic development often means for cities, it's licensing, permitting, right? Getting it easier for developers to do things. I mean, what city has conquered that one? So cities that have online digital systems that are easy to access. I'll talk about some great examples in Dubai and Estonia a bit later. Personalized career centers, career center portals, things that help with jobs. May not be a city purview, but that's another example. Things that make it easier for accommodation, land use. So these sorts of things are definitely tied to economic development, and they're kind of very core to what cities do. So there are tools and techniques that are sort of widely available, particularly looking at the likes of Dubai and Estonia, Singapore, that would give cities a guidance as to kind of what to do to really stimulate that economic development.
Now that's a great overview, and it really, I think, taking that step back and looking at the broader picture is so important for cities, because they tend to sometimes become very myopic in their different projects. And so that's great feedback. So Jonathan, I'm gonna dive into some questions with you. You just published a top-selling Amazon book, so that's exciting, and congratulations, called Smart Cities for Dummies. We all need more, right? We need better resources. We need to learn more from those that are that have their hands deep into this for so long. And so this is very helpful. So you have a wealth of recommendations and tips on how to get started. So maybe share 3 hard-hitting tips for all of us and the audience here. And really, I mean, you've got this great, vast amount of experience with these projects. So we'd love to get your perspective.
Sure. Thank you, Stephanie. And thanks for the privilege to be part of this event today. It's great to be with Janet, Mark, and yourself, and with this esteemed audience. Yeah, thank you so much. I'm very overwhelmed by the success of this book. And I share that with everyone because it's a validation of this market, of this problem set. Our cities are really important for the future of humankind. And, you know, I've been in the space, as you said, for about 10 years. And I wanted to be able to easily articulate the challenges and the solutions for cities all over the world. So I've taken tips and guidance from Janet and Mark and yourself and lots of experts around the world and put them in this easy reference book. And so I worked at the city of Palo Alto, and it was a great platform, being the heart and center of Silicon Valley. It was a great platform to experiment with technology companies and sort of figure out new ways of delivering government. And there's a lot I could share, but I have 3 thoughts as you're asking your question. The first one, and this will be a theme for me, certainly a theme in the book, is recognizing the value of data and basically leveraging that. My quick story: when I entered city life after a career in the private sector, where data had been already identified as a valuable asset, I come into the public sector and I recognize very quickly that everything we do produces data. We collect data, we store it. The city life and government life is saturated with data. So in a world of incredible limitations, right? There's never enough time. There's too many projects, too many problems. There's an abundance of data. So I really want cities to get into the data business. Many are doing great work, and I want to acknowledge that. I mean, we have now chief data officers, but cities still need to step up. There's still a gap between where the vast majority of cities are and their adoption and recognition of the value of data. They're sitting on an incredible resource, and particularly when it comes to IoT. IoT is gathering and sourcing data from all sorts of interesting sensors and endpoints. So you can collect that data, but creating value out of it is really important. The second thing, and I've already heard this as a theme, is to be comfortable with experimentation and to get the support for that. So one of the things that I think was distinguished the work that my team and I did in Palo Alto was the number of experiments we had. And the thing about experiments in the private sector is, you throw some money at a problem and you hope, you throw some money at a problem and you experiment to solve it. And if it doesn't work out, well, that's the cost of doing business. Government doesn't really have that mentality. We want the money that we spend, the taxpayers' money, to be focused on really important things. But we have to be a little bit more generous around that. City leaders, mayors, council members, they need to be comfortable with, we have to throw a bit of money at the experimental stuff too, so that we can see what works and doesn't work. And the final tip is, and I'm very confident this will come up over and over, is this idea of community engagement. You know, my answers aren't not necessarily technological, because the technology, in my view, is often the easier part. So get your people, get your community into the conversation. You know, figure out, I think we're going to talk about that during this conversation today, but that's how we made a difference on a whole slew of complicated things, is we got people on board, we heard people's voices. That's really important.
No, that's really great. I'm going to shift now. So I want to talk a little bit about the technology. So even though I believe the applications and use cases are way more exciting, especially for the audience, sometimes we have to dig into the meat, right? The technology piece, and you mentioned that. And it's vital to understand the role of IoT. You know, I think there are people out there that don't even understand what IoT is and what that means to a city or what that could do for a city. So that's something I want to talk about. So Mark, you have experience in helping cities understand the use of IoT devices and connectivity. Maybe share with us a little bit about your role there, and why you think IoT is so important for some of the projects, right? Some projects are as easy as putting something online, right? But what is IoT, and how does that really impact cities today?
Sure, Stephanie. This speaks to, I see Paul's got a question about how important is technology in the smart city thing. So I'll try and wrap a response into that. Look, technology is just the enabler, right? I mean, we've got to think of it really as part of the ecosystem. And I know that some cities are wary, right, of getting into a smart city place because they're nervous about technology. So you've just got to change your mindset about how you think about it. And the examples I always use is we now have more people holding computers in the hand than ever before. And so think of that as the kind of the sensor you're trying to get information from. The big answer is that a connected community relies on lots of different ways of getting information. And sure, that's going to mean putting sensors in place, using light poles or whatever. But the big opportunity, I think, in the age we're in now is to kind of look at the participatory opportunities there are with people who have devices and how we can access that via permission, of course. So we've got cities that kind of have sensors in place in big street corners. And what they'll then do is get information from people as they kind of move around the street, move around the corner, and kind of build, narratives that inform city planning out of what's actually happening. Now, this is all based on people, agreeing to be involved, because they kind of understand that that's a way in which you can kind of get, maybe the street corner doesn't work, maybe the cycle lane's not working as well as it should. So the opportunity is to kind of use labs, which is what the cities like Singapore and countries like Taiwan do, is a great way to do this, to use the devices we've all got, actually have that as the kind of the participatory interface in the IoT play. One of the best examples, that I think illustrates this, and people from America may have heard of this, is StormSense in Virginia, right? Which was sort of one of any areas that are prone to sort of weather events would want to use sensors to kind of predict. But what they did, rather than just plant sensors around the coast to kind of do a better job of managing floods, they got the community involved. So they used, at the time, one of the largest crowdsourcing activities to say, well, look, it's in your interest, if you've got a place near the beach, to know what's happening with the storm. Rather than employ lots of people, let's also build community to kind of get you involved in using your phones, telling us where the sensors should be. So what a terrific way to kind of both provide information that's useful, but to sort of maybe deal with issues around, oh gosh, there's a sensor going in, I'm a bit nervous about that. So that's a kind of a key way, I think, a different way of thinking about it. Look, it's a really big section. Stephanie, I don't know if you want me to go into sort of more of the specific sort of technology connectivity issues. Perhaps I'll leave it there and maybe come back to it, right? But I think it's the way you think about IoT and technology is the challenge for leaders. Don't get too preoccupied with the kind of the technical aspects of it.
Yeah, I agree. I think that, we want to leave it to our technology vendors and partners to really worry about the complicated stuff, because our theme here today is really connectivity. And it's community involvement, community engagement. And if you don't have that, then a lot of this technology doesn't mean anything. We can throw it out the window. And sometimes cities they forget that they actually have all these great resources already in their city. They have fiber, they have right of ways, they have access, they have Wi-Fi and things like that. Things that they may not even have to build or do anything extra to make some things work from an IoT perspective. They already have the infrastructure. So let's take a little bit of a shift, because I think technology is sometimes, I like to think of it as an afterthought, because right now I want to focus our discussion around some of the cases, right? The use cases. So technology plans, of course, they play an important role, but in some cases the cities can produce results given their infrastructure and tech resources. So not all projects involve money or require money exchanging hands. And in fact, there are so many cities that are trying to drive no cost projects, or projects that just don't really need funding, right? And maybe they're even producing a new amount of revenue for the city. So Janet, I want, you working with the city, how important is technology in the equation for smart city projects? And maybe, do you lead with technology, or do you think that most of your involvement are they leading with data, because data is your passion, or are they leading with a result that they're looking for, or an outcome, or an application?
So definitely sort of going back to where we started, and the theme for this being around citizen-centric, and also remembering that citizens don't just necessarily mean the general public. So it's anyone really living in the city, which includes the students, which includes the business people, which includes the academic staff, which includes everybody really. So that whole consideration of what the everybody needs, and what they sort of want, and what for them a smart city is. So it's definitely around the outcomes. Technology is an enabler. It's about what we can do with that technology that will help the city become more livable, workable, and sustainable. So we constantly hear the term use cases. So essentially, and they do, some of them are actually quite technology heavy, but really what we want to know, and what we want to read about, and what we want to actually influence decisions with, is stories of success, of impactful initiatives that people can relate to, and so that encourages that buy-in from those different stakeholders. So I've talked previously, sort of in terms of the place of technology in a smart city as the city as software concept. So just like the city's infrastructure right now, if you consider, enables us to move around and for the city to operate in supporting citizens, you talked about the roads, you talked about other basic infrastructure. The next step, so if you think about the sewerage systems and the water and things like that, so the next step is to augment that infrastructure with emerging technologies that essentially activate the infrastructure. So just like now, we don't sort of see the infrastructure, it just sort of enables us to move around and do what we need to do. The software, then the city as software, needs to do the same thing. So be behind the scenes and supporting citizens to more effectively, engage with whatever it is they're engaging with, in their day-to-day sort of routine and their different stakeholder perspectives. So in that respect, technology is essential, but the conversation does not lead with, or is not dominated by, a focus on technology. So the focus on what does the investment enables when it comes to the citizens of the city, and as part of this is the conversation is around the technology, but it's really around the difference that we're making to the citizens. So after connectivity and devices, as you mentioned, and it's one of my passions, is the important ingredient, and Jonathan mentioned it as well, is data. So the collection, communication, crunching of data has been mentioned, that enables that seamless operation of the city as software. And it's the data that enables a city to be more livable, workable, and sustainable. So I know we talk about it as the Internet of Things, and that concept of that connectivity between devices, but I like to consider it as the intelligence of things. So I will talk a little bit about that later, but around what the data enables and what we need to be thinking about when we take a data perspective on this city as software concept. And importantly, and so I'll talk about the technology aspect of that later around edge computing and real-time analytics. But in terms of the data, the important thing there is around considering what you're collecting that data for, privacy, security, ethics, who should have access to it, who shouldn't have access to it, and what are you going to be doing with that data, and ensuring that there's a data governance framework. So as much as the technology is behind the scenes, and it's about enabling those citizens and the city to be more livable, workable, and sustainable, the data component does have to lead the conversation in many respects, and it's that governance of that data that's key.
I want to jump quickly because we have about 5 or 7 minutes where we really need to take some questions. We actually have some really good questions in the Q&A that I do want to take. So I'm going to jump a little bit further down and maybe talk about the role of the community. We've talked a little bit about that, but Janet, and then I'll jump to Jonathan, how can cities best get their community and citizens involved, right? How do they do that? How do they get started?
Yep. So if we're talking about the general public, it's the touch points. So what a city needs to consider, and you mentioned this before, is the city is also already doing a number of things that actually can be considered as part of moving forward as a smart city. So you need to consider, when is it that you engage with your citizens already? So it's thinking about that in respect of now using those same channels to engage them in this conversation around a smart city. So we've got libraries, we've got other services that actually touch citizens. We've got other opportunities where citizens get together. You might be talking about a new suburb development. You might be talking about sort of the next thing around your 10-year plan or your annual plan, and wanting to engage with stakeholders. And so going right back to what I was talking about, getting that internal buy-in, is embedding your smart city strategy within the organization, so that those existing channels where your citizens are already engaged with the council are leveraged for the smart cities initiative as well. Outside of that, we've talked about that wider stakeholder pool, universities, the startup community, the general business community. So a number of sort of ways to take that sort of citizen-led concept further. Making data available, so having open data available, and enabling those academics, and enabling even schools that want to do IoT projects to have access to that data, providing funding potentially around that through partners. So a public-private partnership is quite important, and alignment with organizations that think the same as you and want to get to the same endpoint around the city. Providing relationships with academics where we're engaging in research, collaborative research with academics to actually move the city forward. Remembering that you can't just pick up a strategy from another city and bring it to your city. Your city is unique. Your citizens are unique. There's different. Even within New Zealand, there's different reasons for moving down the smart city road. And then I think the important thing is continuing that engagement. So often I think cities, and with any project, you start off with a hiss and a roar, and yes, we're going to do this co-creation. We're going to get you into a room and understand what you need, and we're going to deliver that for you, and you're going to be involved in it. And then we sort of fall over. So as much as the roadmap is a technology roadmap, the roadmap needs to also, and I've mentioned this before, consider that ongoing engagement. So I think there's sort of some different, so where do citizens already congregate? Where are citizens already connected with the council? How can we use partners to engage citizens as well through their existing channels? So we're not reinventing wheels, we're not creating anything new. What we're doing is leveraging what's already there more effectively by embedding the smart city strategy in existing processes and systems, I guess, and initiatives across the city. And if there are new things that need to be pulled together, then they should be sustainable.
Now, speaking of data, I think that, data is such an important aspect of what we're talking about today, and something that I think some cities really are challenged with when it comes to that whole shift of data versus citizen privacy or business privacy. So Jonathan, what do you believe are the most important pieces for data? We're collecting data, we're analyzing data, we're trying to make that data intelligent. Janet, you talked about open government, right? We've talked about open government for quite some time, but we also often see that different departments and agencies within cities sometimes don't want to share their data. So how does this collaborative approach work? Maybe Jonathan, you want to talk about what your perspective is around data and the privacy versus sharing.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. We have to recognize the importance of privacy, and also recognize that privacy is often a reflection of culture. So any answer or any implementation that someone could share with you needs to consider the city and the country and the culture by which it is implemented. The brief answer I will give is, if anyone is sort of embarking on this journey, and I would encourage all cities to have some sort of data strategy, is to make sure you have data governance in place. It sounds like one of those nerdy things, but my experience, both technology governance and data governance have been two of the most important success factors for the work that I've done with many teams, both in the private sector and in the public sector. So data governance is really about leveraging the value of data. It's a whole set of processes. It's quite a mature process, a mature space. So, there's good literature on it. There's good case studies, but it plays directly into your privacy question. First of all, you make a decision as a city that, our data is valuable to the city and the community. Now, how do we take advantage of that? How do we make sure it's secure? We got to focus on cybersecurity too. And how do we consider privacy concerns? And they all get addressed during this life cycle that we call data governance. So I think that's really the core answer there.
No, that's really helpful. I think that citizens could use more resources and support, and they need to look to their vendors and really help get their vendors involved with how do we actually put that framework together. So Mark, my last question is for you before we jump into some of these questions. We might do a rapid fire session to try to get one-line answers to some of these questions that we have from our audience. So Mark, so the pandemic, right? We're all living in this craziness, right? So how has that changed cities? Do their priorities change? Do they do something different? Do citizen safety and other things become much more of a higher priority? What's your feedback around that, Mark?
Oh yeah, it's having an impact, that's for sure. Most of the cities that we work with are doing versions of emergency city budgets, having to sort of really actually sadly focus on cutting costs, depending on how diversified their revenue impact is. And I think I'm encouraging our cities to take a step back. People may know of Jared Diamond, the Pulitzer Prize winning geographer who wrote Guns, Germs and Steel. He had a terrific piece in the Financial Times recently saying, even though all the political leaders are saying cities are under threat, I think the governor of New York is saying we have to redo cities. Actually crises are inevitable, is what Jared Diamond says. And so is it that we recover. So, if you look at the perspective on this, you think, well, let's be really wary of making short-term decisions that are actually going to make the recovery more difficult. Critical is to kind of survey populations. So one of the groups I'm on leads a sort of city network group. We've surveyed our members about what are their priorities. And guess what? Transport and climate change, the top two priorities in many cities, are less important right now. So economic recovery, poverty are higher priorities. And also this thing about COVID response projects. So my message to kind of people involved with cities is you kind of really need to do a baseline reset about what you think your priorities are. This is not to say transport and climate change aren't critical, but what's the focus over the next year? 70% of businesses in many cities are saying they're going to be impacted, and people even more so. So this is an opportunity to refocus on the things that actually deliver, the urgency that citizens are talking about now. And you're only going to know what those are if you have the data that comes from people. And it can't just be a top-down cut approach. We actually need to sort of reach out to people in more innovative ways to kind of make sure those new pieces of information are informing the decision making.
So that's a really great summary. So I think that our theme here is just really city involvement, city engagement, citizen involvement, citizen engagement, having a plan, really looking at your data governance policies and your structure and making sure that you have all of your things in place there and working with your vendors and your ecosystem to really make some of these priorities and these projects happen. So we're going to do a rapid fire session. So we have some really great questions from Walter, Stephen, and Paul, and a few others. And Dave, and I want to make sure that we get to those. So in 1 minute or less, anybody chime in, we're going to one answer for each. So, okay, first one from Paul. In the opinion of the speakers, what's the main challenge cities have in looking and defining a smart cities vision? Anyone?
Leadership. So you need a champion. That can be a part-timer who just works a few hours a week. Doesn't need to be the chief executive, doesn't need to be the mayor, it often won't be. So you've got to have someone who's a champion.
Good one. Yeah, Janet, did you want to say something real quick?
Yeah, I would say that the difference between being a smart council and a smart city, I think there's still a challenge there where the council's more focused on their services outward rather than what a city truly means to everybody that's there.
Great feedback. Thank you. So from Dave, can any of the panelists have experience overcoming pockets of political resistance to projects in progress, proposed projects?
I'll give a quick answer. First of all, tons of empathy from all of us. It's part of the world. It's part of smart cities. By the way, it's part of the complexity of driving innovation in any organization, by the way. There's always resistors. There's always someone who's going to say no. I'll tell you my secret. It's basically patience and perseverance. People often say, well, you worked in Palo Alto and Silicon Valley. People were always saying yes, and everybody wanted to do tech stuff. And I say, well, some people were like that, but many people said no the first time. And even when I went back the second time and said no, but by the third time I came back with a better rationale and more data, and people softened up a little bit, they saw the value, then things happen. So be more patient and persevere if you believe in it.
So I heard Mark talk about a bottoms-up approach. So one of the questions is from Walter. Can you comment on the relative merits of different smart city approaches? For example, Barcelona, bottom-up participation versus Singapore, more top-down mandated.
Look, it speaks to something Jonathan said. It depends on the constituency. You've got to kind of build a smart city strategy that's right for the people. And so the Singaporeans, I mean, we've got an office there. They're very happy with the top-down approach, actually. Works for them. But the likes of Barcelona and other cities have to be much more focused on that. So look, and Jeanette made the same comment, right? You build a strategy for the people you're trying to serve, and that's going to be different in different cities.
Okay, so we have a question around the ecosystem, and Stephen, I'll answer that one because I use that word a lot. And we use that in our industry. We use that quite often in market research. And essentially what you do is you look at a city and you look at all of the touch points of that city, right? You have your citizens, you have the leadership, you have the governing bodies, the people that are elected, the elected officials, and then you have, all of the resources in all the different departments and agencies. That's part of the internal ecosystem. Then there's the technology ecosystem or the partners and all of the third-party touch points, which might be vendors, partners, systems integrators, people that are providing the infrastructure, the waste management, water resources, all of those different things that might not necessarily be publicly managed, but might also be part of a public-private partnership or be privately offered. So all of these components are very important. If you don't really look at your city and start to look at all of those different things and how they impact the city, then you really don't have a good vision of taking that step back. So I think that's a really important piece of it. So the ecosystem. So we have another question from Walter. What are the top 1 or 2 excuses, real or imagined, for the reluctance by cities from not embracing the smart city paradigm? Anybody want to talk about that?
I think if I just quickly say, either they think there's 2 extremes. Either they think they already are, because, and someone mentioned it in the chat, because they've got smart lights and that's smart cities. But I think the other one is they're just not ready. They are just not ready because they're not sure. They think a smart city means all the bells and whistles and everything that they're hearing from different parts of the world. But actually, like you said, Stephanie, before, and we've talked about it, is just start with what you've got and take stock. But actually, you're actually already smart to a degree, and you're just continuing on that journey. It's a journey. It's not a let's throw everything out right now and start fresh.
So no, that's really great. I think that sometimes we just have to look at what we have before we make decisions and prioritize and move forward. So a couple of more questions. So we didn't get the chance to talk about sustainability and the importance of sustainability for cities, and that also being a driver for different IoT projects, especially sensor networks and things that we're tracking. Can maybe each of you talk a little bit about the importance of sustainability and maybe even your own experiences, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I'm happy to go first on this one. Totally passionate about this space. I really, really care about the environment and the planet. I actually refer to the term, smart and sustainable cities. I think dropping in the sustainable term there is probably quite valuable. And it's another, motivation in the argument for mayors and community that this, isn't just about digitalization and more efficiencies. This is about lowering carbon emissions and protecting the community and the environment. The city of Palo Alto was very active in this area. We had for a small city, we had a chief sustainability officer, and I collaborated with him quite a lot. Technology intersects almost with everything. So, one of the, I guess, to be brief, the key area, two key areas real quick. One was in how we used energy. And so we were lucky enough in our city to actually own the utility. So we were fully, had electricity, gas, wastewater, and that type of thing. So, sensors and IoT come in really handy when you have a sort of a utility infrastructure for a whole range of things, measuring, powers, it travels, looking for errors, looking for wastage. And then the second area is transportation. And here in Northern California, that's about 70% of the sustainability problem is trucks and cars and buses and things like that. So, as we move towards more electric vehicles, more connected vehicles, autonomous vehicles, the world of transportation is changing, and that's going to impact sustainability.
Stephanie, can I just say briefly, the other reason that sustainability is important is because it's really easy to measure. So in terms of all the smart city things, I mean, lighting, waste, water, you can measure these things quite easily. So in terms of Paul's question about KPIs and ROIs and paybacks, the sustainability play in smart cities is something that gets a quick investment return. And that's a key reason for me as to why that should be a key part of the smart city agenda.
No, that's good feedback. So those outcomes can be measured and tracked very easily using sensor networks and IoT solutions that are out there today. So final 10-second remarks. Any great tips, resources, or final words you want to give? Janet, we'll start with you. Go ahead.
Well, I'll answer the sustainable question, because my perspective on sustainability, other than the environment, is actually the sustainable vision for the city. So if you get the strategy right, and it's about the why, not the what, and you've got the right stakeholders involved, and you consider it as a journey, not a point in time where you can stick a flag in the ground and say that we're now a smart city, I think that's sustainable. So that's actually the proposition to continue to be citizen-centric in developing your city to enable it to be livable, workable, and sustainable as a long-term journey, not a goal at a point in time.
Right now, Jonathan. Go ahead, Jonathan.
Yeah, real quick. Shameless plug, my book. I'm in total marketing mode. So, I didn't write the book to become, rich or famous. I wrote it to help. I wrote it to help. I really mean that. And so Smart Cities for Dummies is available for pre-order right now. I think it has all the guidance, everything we've talked about today in one place. The question came up real fast. I wanted to touch on it, which is how do you measure sustainability? And one of the key metrics is, carbon emissions, basically, and relative carbon emissions. So, what are your carbon emissions right now relative to, say, 1990? What are your targets for reduction? I think that's a key area.
And Mark, go ahead.
So reference points, if people aren't connected, Smart Cities World and Smart Cities Dive. These are two online news platforms that summarize great things that are happening around the world. Most people, I'm sure, will be connected, but if you're not, those are two great channels to kind of get ideas about things that are working and also where there are some problems. But my last thing is find that champion or become that champion yourself. If you're battling the bureaucracy or your boss or the mayor or whoever, become that champion yourself. And those tools we've talked about, and hopefully some of the conversation today will give you a steer.
And I guess I'll do a final plug too. I don't know, Janet, with the Smart Cities Council is regional. There's different bodies that are involved. There's all kinds of organizations that are pushing initiatives and working collaboratively, some in your own city. So always look there first. And then also, of course, Compass Intelligence, we're a great resource for market research reports looking at the industry and who's really doing what. We also prepared a Smart Cities index, which kind of highlights some of the top companies in the smart cities sector. And we do that privately for some companies as well for projects. And it's always fun to kind of help companies really identify who's best in class and who's doing what. But again, we really thank you all for joining us today. This has been a great discussion. I appreciate you, Janet, Mark, and Jonathan. Your information and intelligence is really just phenomenal. So we thank you for joining us today, and we hope you enjoy this session and all have a great rest of the day and enjoy the rest of IIoT World. Thank you.
Great.
Thank
Thank you.
Stay
Thank you.
safe, everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks.